Good afternoon or good morning, Tracy.
Hi, how you doing?
Good. Good morning.
Good
Is it
morning.
morning, right there?
It is morning, yeah, it's 9 a.m. So yeah, good to see
Yeah,
you.
9 a.m. Yeah, good to
And
see
good
you
afternoon
too.
to you as well. Yeah.
Yeah, it's 3 o'clock today here.
Okay, nice.
Okay.
Nice.
You're doing it from home or was it at your office?
I am at home. We have a little shed outside, so I have my heater on.
Oh,
Yeah, so it's great. It's good to see you. Yeah.
oh, okay.
Halo,
Hi,
good
hello.
afternoon, Tracy.
Apologies, I
Halo.
wasn't able to put the background on, and my computer won't let me do that. I don't know why. I'm so sorry. But I
That's
I'm going to
okay.
set a very nice backdrop, but I will blur my screen so that it's less.
That's okay, Tracy. No worry. We have here Pak Heri Chandra. This Pak Heri is our head of department.
Hi,
Hello.
nice to meet you, and thank you
Nice to meet you, Tracy. Firstly, yes, it's my pleasure to have you here because looking at the title of our lecture today, I think this must be very interesting for our students.
hopefully hopefully, but
Yeah.
thank you so much. It's great to be able to share some of these ideas with you, and thank you for the invitation. It's a really generous invitation, and I really appreciate being able to do it.
Yeah, we thank you more. I mean, it's a great opportunity for us to have this kind of topics here.
Mhm.
Okay. We'll be begin in a short minute. Is there anything you wanna say first? Like maybe you wanna the slides, you wanna ask to help you with the slides or
It's fine. I might just, if I'm okay to just share my screen, just to check that the
oh, okay.
that everything works and that you can see everything. Is that okay?
Yeah, that will be fine.
And
That's
apologies
okay.
for my desktop. If Gurinder is watching, she will know very well how awful my desktop is. So apologies for that. Right. Let me see. So hopefully you can see.
Okay, yeah, we can see it already. Yeah, I mean, yeah,
Okay.
before this, we like we would like to have some particular opening and things like that. Hope you don't mind with that.
No, not at all. That's wonderful. Thank
Okay.
you. So I've stopped sharing now, hopefully. So you should.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
All right. We begin now? Okay, yeah, we'll begin in a short minute. Okay. Okay. Yeah, so Tracy, we're going to begin because the Dean of Faculty of Humanities is already here. So yeah, I'm going to refer it to our Master of Ceremony to begin with. Tuan Berdini.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Louise. Yeah, we will begin. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and good morning for Dr. Tracy Cosley. We are truly honored to have the presence of our Dean, Professor Dr. Alamsah M. Hum, as along with the head of English Literature Study Program, Dr. Oktiva Heri Chandra M. Hum, and of course, our standing invited speaker, Dr. Tracy Cosley from University of Essex, as well as our moderator, Ms. Dwi Wulandari, SSMA from Universitas Diponegoro. Thank you everyone for joining our visiting lecture today with the topic Negotiating Identity Learners Identity in FLL in University. This event hosted by the Faculty of Humanities, Universitas Diponegoro. And I'm Dini as Master of Master Ceremony for today's event. Yeah, I will briefly convey our agenda for this afternoon. First is the opening by me as MC, and then the second singing the national anthem of Indonesia, Indonesia Raya, and then a welcoming speech by our Dean of the Faculty of Humanities, by Professor Dr. Alam Shah M. Hum. And then next presentation of our topic today with the theme Negotiating Identity, Learner's Identity in FLL in University by our speaker, Dr. Tracy Cosley, which will be guided by our moderator, Dwi Wulandari SSMA, followed by Q&A session. Now, everyone, let's start with our first agenda today, which is singing the national anthem of Indonesia, Indonesia Raya. For the operator, the script is yours. Okay, thank you very much, everyone. Now, let us, all of us, hear the welcoming speech by the Dean of Humanity Faculty, Universitas Diponegoro, Professor Dr. Alam Shah M. Hum. Over to you, Professor Alam.
Ya, oke, thank you, Mbak Dini. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam.
Excellencies, the honorable guest speakers, Dr. Tracy Cosley from University of Essex. Good morning, ya. Dr. Tracy, thank you very much. Welcome to a virtual Zoom meeting in Faculty of Humanities. The head of the Undergraduate English Literature Study Program, Bapak Dr. Oktiva Heri Chandra. Thank you. The moderator of this event, Ibu Dwi Wulandari SSMA. Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all for joining today for this exciting event, Negotiation Identity, Learner's Identity in FLL in University, helped by the Undergraduate English Literature Study Program. In our increasingly interconnected world, the importance of language learning cannot be overstated. Today, we will delve into the intricate relationship between negotiation and learner's identity, particularly in the context of foreign language learning, or FLL, at the university level. And then this discussion is crucial as the highlight how our identities influence our learning process and outcomes. Negotiation is not just a tool for reaching agreement, it is also a vital part of how we construct our identities as learners. As we navigate different cultures and languages, we encounter opportunities to redefine who we are. Understanding this negotiation of identity can empower learners, enhance engagement, and lead to more effective language acquisition. Today, we will hear from Dr. Tracy Kosley, who will share their insight and research on this topic. We encourage you to actively participate in the discussion and share your thoughts and experiences. As we embark on this journey together, I invite you to keep an open mind and engage with the material presented. Your perspective are invaluable, and I encourage question and discussion throughout the session. Thank you once again for being here. Let's make the most of this opportunity to explore the complex interplay of negotiation and identity in foreign language learning. Without further ado, let's get starting. And then thank you very much. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Yeah, thank you for Prof. Alam as our Dian. Now, everyone, before we start the main agenda today, let us all take a group picture first. Therefore, if you haven't turned on your camera, please do it now. Open your camera, please. Okay, so I will start counting. 1, 2, 3. Okay. Once again, 1, 2, 3. Okay. Okay. Enough. Thank you. Okay. Now, everyone, we have reached the core of the event that has been anticipated, which is the delivery of our topic, negotiating identity, learner's identity in FLL in university, by our speaker today, Dr. Tracy Kosley, which will be guided by our moderator, Dwi Wulandari, SSMA. Over to you, Ms. Dwi.
Yeah, thank you very much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning again, Dr. Kosley. And once again, thank you very much for your willingness to give this topic to us, to give us some highlight about the negotiations of identity. Before we begin, I would like to read some CV of Dr. Kosley. There are so many acknowledgement that I can find, but maybe I can just cut it a little bit short if that's okay. So Dr. Tracy Kosley is the senior lecturer of TEFL or TESOL at the Language and Linguistics of University of Essex. And she is now the head of the Department of Language and Linguistics of University of Essex. She holds her master's degree in Language, Ethnicity and Education from King College London and PhD from King College London also. Her research areas mostly on English as language, additional language learners, academic literacies, and also student identity and writing at university. So this is really in line with our topics today, yeah? Because some of this is maybe a new issue in Indonesia. It's like we don't really think about how Indonesian students face their different identity when they are learning foreign language. So that's her research areas. She had a lot of publications, among others are on the multilingual university, language ideology, and then language policy and practices in several countries in Malawian University. And also she had also publication in the topic of rethinking language, the need for language supportive pedagogy with teacher training in Tanzania. Translanguaging is also part of what she has wrote, and also emerging principles of researching multilinguality and linguistic ethnography. There are also several books, like discipline-specific writings, and also creativity and discovery in university writings for a teacher's guide. If I want to continue, it may be on and on. And so maybe not to waste more time, maybe we can just go to Dr. Tracy Cosley for probably 1 hour sessions of the lectures, and then we will continue with question and sessions. Now it's over to you, Dr. Cosley.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much for the really very kind and generous introduction. It's very nice of you, and again also thank you for inviting me to be here with you today virtually to kind of talk about some of the things that I'm currently working on or trying to work on and trying to sort of process. I hope the topics are that I'm going to talk about, I hope they're interesting to you, and I hope they match in some way with the kinds of things that you're thinking of, or you can find similarities with your own situations or contexts and your own work. I know these things always seem quite formal, but I think, as your colleagues have also said, if at any point you're not sure or you don't understand or something happens, you think, what is she talking about? Please do say, like, feel free to use the chat, feel free to kind of raise your hand and ask comments. And I'm very happy for this to be a sort of a, quite relaxed in that sense. So as you said, I'll try and talk for, about 45 minutes or an hour or so, and then there'll hopefully be time for questions as well. But as I said, hopefully if there's anything that you'd like to ask in between time, please do feel free to say. Hopefully you can see my screen. Yes, is that yeah. So as you sort of said, I've been working in and around these kinds of topics for a while. And so some of the things I'm going to talk about today are linked to current research, but they're also linked to research of other colleagues and people whose work I draw upon. But what I wanted to sort of begin by saying is, some of the things that I would like to try and do is to, this idea of how we talk about identity. And one of the things that I think is interesting for me in talking to students who I've worked with or talking to teachers who I work with is how we manage our identities in a way. And with connection to language learning, I think for me, sort of languages and identities often are synonyms. They are often the same thing, or they are really closely linked. So if this idea of kind of how people manage languages in classes and what that does or doesn't do in terms of supporting learners, or how that helps teachers or not. So this is an area that I am currently interested in, and sort of linking with this idea of negotiation. And I think that's a really important word, certainly. To do that, I might try and reflect a little bit on ideas of monolingualism. And I say that recognizing that I am delivering this talk in English, so I apologize for the irony of this, but I also welcome that much of what has happened in the beginning of the talk is, that everyone is using other languages as well. So, but for me, I will be delivering this through English, so I apologize for my own limitations there. And this idea of translanguaging, so this is something that has been quite prominent in literature over the last sort of few years, and so I just wanted to share a bit about how that features in the kind of work that I'm doing, and how or why I think that's interesting and helpful maybe. So hopefully this will be of interest to you. So I just, if we're talking about identities and we're talking about, who we are, I thought it might be nice to share a little bit about myself. So as you've sort of said kindly as well, my background, I started out as an undergraduate student in anthropology. So I've always been interested, I think, in how people do things. So how do people come together in spaces and interact, and what is the role of language in that? And this photo might seem slightly random, but it's the hometown where I live is on the coast in the UK, so it has a very nice beach. It doesn't have much else, but it does have a very nice beach, and we play rounders. It's a tradition in my family. We've played that for many years, sometimes on picnics or things. So one of the things I'm interested in here is that this person standing at the back is my partner, and these are my sort of members of my family. And when we talk at home, when I speak with my family, when we play rounders, there's language in the rounders that is really familiar to my sister, who's this person here, and my parents, who are kind of running somewhere. but my partner was on this day, he was like, I don't know what you're all saying. And what are you all talking about? So there's this sort of interesting moment where he didn't know the language of rounders. He doesn't play that with his family. And he's not used to playing it with my family either. So it was this interesting moment, I think, of people coming together to do things, and we do things in different ways with the language that we have. And so this is kind of something that's often, is throughout the work that I've been doing. And it's really informed, I think, a lot by the work that I've done as an English language teacher. So my background is in teaching English, mostly in context of Southeast Asia. Sadly, I never made it to teach in Indonesia, but there's still time. But the idea that sort of, across these different contexts, how people are coming together to do things. So these are the kinds of things that I am interested in. And as you've mentioned, sort of the type of research that I do is linked to ideas about language learning and teachers, and quite often to do with language policy. So how does the macro stuff that is around us, whether that's, the school that we work in, whether that's the universities that we work in, whether that's the kind of legal framework that we work in, how does that influence what we do? And how does that shape the kinds of things we're able to do? And in the context of UK higher education, which is the context that I'm probably going to focus a bit more on today, just because that's where I'm most of my current work at university level is that in the context of the UK, the policies are really monolingual. The schooling and university education happens in and through English, and so I'm interested in that as a tension, or a kind of a challenge for students and for teachers. I also do work on English for academic purposes, and then of course this is all kind of tied together by multilingual classrooms. And so the kind of work that I do, if that's also helpful, is that I do most of my research is done through sort of ethnography, and this ideas of translanguaging, and some of these other words here, so academic literacies, are things that sort of might come up today, but certainly are kind of the feature in the work that I do. So hopefully that gives you a bit of a context for some of the things that I will be talking about. So if we're thinking about language learning and identity, that we know that there's lots of really exciting work that's been done over the last sort of 50, 60, 70 years around language learning and identity in language learning, and particularly I think in the areas that I tend to read about is mostly in and through English. So quite a lot of work that's been done on foreign language learning, I think, is driven by the work that's done on English, but I think quite a lot of it also applies to other languages. So in the context of the UK and my own institution would be in terms of language learning, we might think of that also as English, but also things like French, German, Spanish, Italian, and Mandarin Chinese increasingly. So these, I think, the principles of identity work that colleagues such as Bonnie Norton have been involved in are relevant for English, but they're also relevant for other kind of languages that are in kind of what we mean by sort of foreign language learning as well. So this broader concept of identity, and how, for me, I think I certainly share some of the work or some of the ideas that Bonnie Norton and colleagues like her, where we take identity as being fluid, it's dynamic, it's something that changes, it's something that grows. We have multiple identities in that sense, so we kind of negotiate between the different people who we are. So the identity I have playing rounders with my parents is different to the identity I have when I am meeting my the vice chancellor of our university, for example, or it's different to perhaps the identity that I have in this session today. They're all part of the same thing. They all kind of form this kind of coherent, hopefully, whole. And I think the work of colleagues like Dorothy Holland are really interesting, this idea of a figured world. They talk about how the different people that we are in the different spaces that we inhabit, they all come together. Sometimes these identities are happy together, and sometimes they kind of are a bit more challenging, and that's okay, and that's fine. And we see that a lot, particularly with language learning. And so one of the sort of things I wanted to share a bit with you, again, is sort of some of the motivation for the work that we're doing, is some of the things that I've heard from students. So over the years, these are the kinds of things that some students have sort of said to me, and these may resonate with you or things that you've also heard, things that you may have said. So students have said to me, I feel stupid. In my own language, I'm actually quite intelligent. So this is sort of referring to their uses of English and sort of saying, that they feel sort of frustrated by this. I sound so different. So this sense of, working through other languages, that this didn't feel quite right. In English, I sound like a child. I have said this about my own uses of French and Spanish. I think I sound sort of too young and a bit silly. I wish I could be funny in English and other things. I wish you knew my personality in my own language. So I think these comments, and they are regular, and they're regularly said or written or shared, sometimes in confidence and sometimes openly in classroom spaces. And I think, what is this telling us about sort of perhaps how people feel about these sort of ideas or personalities or identities kind of coming together? So, there's some sort of tensions, maybe. Some other sort of things, on the flip side, maybe, is other students have said, I get to be a different person and it's great. I'm much more confident in English. And then this is, students who were sort of saying about, the spaces they get to operate in. In French, I sound cool. This was sort of a student the other day at the university was sort of saying this. And in Chinese, I can't be like this. It wasn't necessarily an indication of what the this is, but there's this sense that through using English in a particular context in the classroom, they were able to be something that they can't do in these other languages. I feel free is also something that people have said about. So this is mostly at this point about sort of things to do with how people feel when they're speaking, how people feel when they're interacting, and then other things where people have talked specifically about writing. So writing is something that I've sort of looked at quite a bit in the work that I've done. So it's often of interest for me and a source of kind of challenge as to how do people do stuff through writing. And my writing isn't very good. It just doesn't sound like me, particularly with academic writing. There's this sort of sense often where if people are writing essays or people are writing assignments, that there's a disconnect between what they think and what they sound like, perhaps their own internal sound, and then what they sound like when they've written this thing on paper. So perhaps this movement between one language maybe and another, or the English that they sort of have internally, and then this kind of external presentation of it, that they just don't sound the same. I can't be myself in essays. Anyone that's sort of, I think, kind of working in academic writing, or as writers ourselves, I think this is a common feeling, and a common feeling for many people. Interesting sort of where students have sort of said, I don't like to use I in my writing. So we know from kind of different literature that depending on the disciplines that people are working in, and depending on the kind of writing people are being asked to do, that this use of I is quite contentious. So some people promote it, some people don't. So here we have someone saying I like to use it, and here why can't I use I in my writing? So, very contrasting kind of situations there. So being allowed to do something and not wanting to, and not being allowed to do it, but actually wanting to do it as well. And others, again, sort of, it's not all negative. Some of this is really very positive. And so I think I sound smart and I like writing like this. So particularly at the university for the University of Essex, we have a number of students, myself included, who are some of the first in their family to go to university. So they are kind of what we might call sort of first generation university students. So they may not necessarily feel like they can speak in this kind of academic way outside of university. So they don't necessarily get to write and sound like this in their writing. These were also kind of the comments before I went to the University of Essex. I was based in Hong Kong, at City University in Hong Kong, and at that university we did some research with students, again sort of first year students on undergraduate programs involving English language and literature, English language and professional communication, and kind of linguistics type courses. And quite a few of these comments as well are shared by those students. And I have some work that I've done on that where they talk about this kind of, again, these sort of tensions. But for those students, again, similarly, most of them are the first in their family to go to university. And they particularly sort of said things like, you know, when I use English, it shows that I have an education, and it shows that I have, you know, that I'm quite smart. And so I'm quite proud of that. But they also then said, you know, my parents tell me off when I speak like that to my grandparents. So I'm not allowed to show off to them. So again, these kind of interesting moments where people get to do and be different to different people. So I don't know if anyone, you're welcome to share this in the chat or whatever, or just sort of think about it by yourselves if you wanted to. But, you know, how do you think about yourselves in a way? Are these familiar feelings? Do you, within and across the languages you have or you make use of, do you feel the same? Do you feel kind of equally comfortable in all the languages you use? Do you use them for the same things? So I don't know whether there's sort of anything there that might resonate with yourselves. I'll leave that for a moment just in case anyone. Nice. Okay, so you feel more like yourself in speaking in English, and this is interesting, isn't it? Like the kind of idea of how we do that. I'm sure you are. I'm sure you are funny in English. I'm sure that's probably very true. So this, again, these kind of senses where it's not, you know, it's not necessarily an uncommon feeling. Nice. This is really nice, isn't it? Where you can be more yourself in English. And I think these spaces are really important, aren't they? Like where we can do these things. And one of the things I'm sort of interested in, I think, is to what extent. So most of my work has been in, this is sort of English language teaching, but sort of teacher training materials, sort of looking at how we become teachers and what the kind of literature says about what we should do and how we should do that. And I think what I'm going to try, hopefully, to do is to sort of try and have a think about where do these perhaps sort of ideas of separateness or disparateness, or I can do something here that I can't do somewhere else, like where does that come from? I think it's really good that things are really positive, but for me, I think most of the comments that I have linked to this idea of identity or challenges are they're mostly negative, like people feeling like they can't do stuff or that they can't bring these things together. And so that's been something that I've sort of trying to sort of think about and think through, and sort of where does that come from? And I think I'm not saying, you know, teacher training is to blame for this at all, but I think there is, if you look back in kind of the tradition of language teaching, particularly with sort of English language teaching, but that I think it's fair to say that the model for English language teaching, if we think about types of textbooks, if we think about training, if we think about the sort of styles, if we think about sort of communicative language teaching, or generally, like the models for English are similar to models for teaching other foreign languages as well. Like there's not really much difference between them, I think. So when I speak to colleagues who teach French, they use very much the same strategies. Teaching French, sorry, I should say, in at the University of Essex, their models, their methodologies are really similar to how I would have been trained to teach English. That's the same with our Spanish colleagues, with our Italian colleagues, etc., etc. So I think there is something about the way in which teacher training within kind of foreign languages has been conceptualized that really focuses on or somehow creates these moments of disparity or these kind of gaps. And I wonder if there's a different way, and I wonder what that might look like. So just to sort of go over some of this, then in English language teaching, I think what we often find is that the target language or the languages of instruction is the one that is often promoted in classes, that we should only be using that and we shouldn't be using other things. And I remember in my own teacher training, of course, that the trainers were really clear to me about not using a language other than English when we're trying to teach this. In my French classes at school, the teacher also was doing the same thing, like would only speak to us in French and said, you have to do this, it's full immersion, there's no other way. Anything in English is bad and you'll be in trouble, I think. And so this ideology, I think, is really interesting. It comes through in course books, it comes through in training. And there's one, you may be familiar with the work of these colleagues, but so Diane Larson-Freeman and Jeanette Anderson to do some really great work. I mean, these are really good colleagues. And so this comment is more of a reflection on the nature of the subject rather than the work that they're doing, because they really do great stuff. But they sort of, in the book that they have where it talks about teaching methods for English language teachers, they have 13 methods and things like, grammar translation, communicative language teaching. So for those of you who may know something about sort of English language teaching or TESOL type discussions, will be familiar with some of the terminology. But essentially these 13 methods, and only 3 of them actively promote this idea of using students and teachers other languages. So everything else is monolingual through the language of instruction. And I think that's really interesting, because it's basically saying language classrooms and language spaces really should be these kind of monolingual, that there's this language and this is the one we're working in, and that the other things don't really come together, or they shouldn't come together. And this, we see this in kind of discussions where, again, if we look at the literature, it talks about interference, false friends. So where there are connections between kind of L1s, L2s, or people's other languages and the language they're trying to learn, they often get sort of, these negative shapings of interference, or, we shouldn't be doing that. And again, kind of is an interesting position. And I think, this feeds into things that, there are a number of myths that I think circulate still about language learning and uses of language. So we've seen these a lot in, speaking to students at the University of Essex, these ideas I think very much are alive and well. Like, this is what students kind of get this sense. We were recently doing some work in Tanzania, Zambia and Botswana. And we were based at, we were working with colleagues from universities there, but most of the research work that we were doing was in secondary schools. And this was, even though these countries are, massively multilingual, there was still this sort of sense where these things are true, and people kind of believed these kind of ideas, where, we've got this sort of sense of bilingualism happening only in childhood, sort of, if you want to be a real bilingual, accent. So I think these ideas, we see them coming through, and we see them kind of being represented in the kinds of way that students talk about themselves. And I think this is linked to some of those, the students sort of saying, oh, I wish I could do this, or I don't feel I can do that, or I feel sort of, that this idea of things being separate somehow. One of the things that is particularly interesting, I think, to me, is that where we have this idea that's in language classrooms or in the use of languages, that where people might mix languages. So you might start a sentence in one language and then it looks as though it moves into another language, and that this is a problem. Like, this is typically has historically been framed in the literature in this way. And certainly in my experience of working at universities in Hong Kong, this was something that was a real concern for my colleagues. Students shouldn't be using English and Cantonese together. This is really bad. Be like, why is that? And they sort of said, oh, because it's a sign of the students being lazy, or a sign of a problem. They don't know enough of English to be able to finish the sentence, so that's why it's a problem. Or they can't be bothered. And so this is a really interesting sort of situation, I think, where we've got this kind of sense that, it has to be one or the other. I think it's also linked to some work that colleagues, like Alistair Pennycook, for example, kind of work on, where we look at this idea of, particularly for the things that I'm doing, and particularly for conversations I have with students around English, that somehow, if they're doing something at university, it has to be through English, because if not, it's not very good. But somehow, it's better through English. And so, again, internationally, we see sort of, the spread of these sort of languages and kind of some of this motivation. For me, though, what is particularly interesting about this set of ideas as well is this idea of kind of English medium instruction or English only instruction, that this is, that this is also kind of a gold standard. And again, I sort of wonder about that, and I wonder about the messages that gives to people about sort of how we should experience language, and what that does in terms of our sense of identities. And I think that's where there's a problem. So in work that we do a lot in primary schools and secondary schools, but also at we've seen this also at universities, particularly in the universities I was mentioning in Hong Kong, but this was also the same for colleagues in the universities where we were working in Africa, where colleagues felt that, you know, students, if they're learning a language, so if students are coming from a different language background, that if they're trying to acquire English, that they should only be using English, and that any other language is a problem, and they shouldn't be in the classroom, and they shouldn't be using that at home. So trying to kind of move towards this sort of, you know, only using the target language. Parents are encouraged to use the sort of English as much as possible. And languages is policed. So there's lots of examples where children or students are punished for using kind of multiple languages in classrooms, that it should only be this one language. So again, if we're thinking about how does that impact on people's sense of self, people's sense of identity, if you feel that you are not allowed to do these certain things, it becomes a real problem. And particularly if we think about you know, languages in the broader sense of what this means in terms of language hierarchies, the sense of importance of language, and the promotion of languages other than these kind of big sort of dominant languages. So we get this sort of thing of, you know, this sort of tension between things being sort of monolingual and multilingual. And this is where I think the ideas of something around translanguaging then are really, really exciting and really important, because it changes some of this. And it sort of suggests that some of this is really problematic, and is not helpful in many ways to what we're trying to do. So some of the key, I think some of the key discussions within translanguaging suggest that in these previous versions of language, maybe we sort of see these things, if we think about code mixing, or if we think about language A and language B, that somehow they're separate, and that we have, say, for example, English might be over here and French or German in somewhere else, and that these can be separated, and that's an ideal situation. What translanguaging says, though, is that actually it's really not like that, that our brains don't store them in this way, and it's not a kind of a one or the other, that actually they're always together. They are not bounded in this way. They're not separate. They're kind of much more fluid, and they kind of move around, and that movement is really important and kind of helpful. And so what I am interested in is if we start thinking about teaching and learning and language uses from this type of perspective, where does that take us in terms of how people might feel about themselves and feel about the languages that they have? And I think if we adopt this, we end in a very different place, and which I think for me is a potentially much more positive one, maybe, in a way. So something that colleagues and I have talked about as well is this idea of kind of being multilingual. So if the goal of foreign language learning is this sort of sense of adding language, or, you know, we're already starting, for most people, starting from a position of being multilingual, that it is very much this sort of lived experience for people, rather than just adding on, here's another language, here's another language, here's another language. So this sort of sense that things are dynamic, and that we can do different things in and through language, but that they're always connected, and that they're always kind of in motion. And so this is sort of one of the things I think is kind of interesting in a way, in terms of what we might be able to do, and how we might be able to perhaps reconceptualize some of these myths, or some of these kind of separations, to sort of say, well, if we're taking translanguaging as an approach or as an understanding, what might that help us to do? And so in terms of kind of pedagogy, in terms of kind of teaching, there's lots of work that's done on this. If this is an area that people are interested in, or already familiar with, these won't be sort of new names for you, maybe. But you know, this work has been going on for a really long time, in the sense of it, you know, starting in schools in the 1990s, where colleagues trying to do this sort of reconciliation between, in 1994, particularly between Welsh and English. So schools across Wales, where there was a challenge for teachers who were teaching in Welsh and English, and sort of, you know, English perhaps becoming more dominant than Welsh, and that not being an ideal situation, or not being the wanted outcome. And sort of, you know, with this idea of translanguaging, everything that was said in English had to then be said in Welsh. Everything done in Welsh had to be the same done in English. Any writing, listening, reading, speaking, etc., in order that these things would kind of progress in the same way. And this is sort of some of the early versions of translanguaging, if you like, and it has, I think, had a really positive impact on the way in which Welsh, or Welsh is a language now where there are more speakers in Wales than there were at the time that this work started anyway. So I think that, there has been a positive contribution from that. And since then, this work has kind of gone on and been taken up by lots of colleagues, but particularly with this idea of how do you make classrooms fairer for students who might be struggling with these different identities, or who have resources, who have identities through kind of the languages that they have, but they're not able to use them in classrooms. So the work that those colleagues have been doing has been really interesting in this sense of trying to draw in all the linguistic resources. And it says the child here, so mostly the work that these colleagues were doing were with children, but this is now an approach that's being used with adults and kind of postgraduate students as well. So it's not just for younger learners, but to sort of try and say, well, okay, if we're taking rather than sort of say to students, you're in a French class now, so everything else has to be left behind. What we are sort of saying is that you're in a French class now, so what are you bringing with you? How do these other things help you in French? How do these other things kind of add to, how do your other languages add to your understanding of French, and what can we do with that? So I think it's a much more this sense where it's integrated. And I think sort of trying to understand languages perhaps from the beginning as being these more integrated processes perhaps help us then avoid some of these kind of more fractionalized senses of identity potentially that we see happening and that pose real challenges for learners. So just another sort of quote here, apologies for these long quotes, but I think they're interesting in this sort of sense that what happens if we take translanguaging, so this idea of kind of moving between languages, kind of supporting that in classes, is that students can then bring what they have to the surface. And this idea, so that what we see here, so students to bring their language practices to the surface and into the open so that they can be refracted in an image of language that fits with the state and school definitions. So one thing that many things that we know from language research is that often students who don't see themselves in the materials or who don't see themselves in the classroom practices feel it's not for them. So we know that lots of students don't take kind of language classes or drop out or feel that they're not very good at this because the things that happen around them don't include them. And so that's there has been a shift, particularly for English language teaching materials, to be much more inclusive and much more representative over the years. But often that takes the form of different photos, maybe different pictures in textbooks, sort of making kind of different use of different names in textbooks. So we've seen a shift, which is a positive shift in that sense of things looking more inclusive and being more inclusive. But we still see that textbooks are really still very, very monolingual, so that there's only sort of one language in them. And again, sort of increasingly, what does that look like? Is there space for language learning to be a much more multilingual practice? And so research that we are doing in schools in the UK, but also now in across these countries in Africa as well, is looking at, if you make materials more multilingual from the beginning, does it help students feel that they are being more included? Does it allow for better inclusion? And therefore, does it allow for better learning? And what we are finding is that the answers to that are yes. We think whether students are more engaged perhaps in classes, they're perhaps more interested in it because they think it's for them. And therefore, if we feel that motivation, if you're looking at some sort of Sultan Donier's work, that motivation plays a really important part in language learning, then that should be what a key to what we're trying to do is, if we can motivate students through the types of work that they're asked to do in classrooms, hopefully that helps in this kind of longer term endeavor of language learning. And we know that this is important because these are some quotes where I, again, from some research that I was doing in classrooms at local schools close to the University of Essex. So these classrooms are all multilingual in the sense where there are students who are speakers of other languages. So they're in an English medium school, but they are these students were sort of reception here, so they're sort of 4 and 5 years old, so they're very little. And this is the comments from their teachers, who sort of said, oh, you know, I never hear the other languages. I know they speak together outside the class, and I know they speak to each other in Arabic, but they don't, you know, they don't do that here. Or they may hear something that when they come back from the holidays, but then it sort of switches. Or parents, you know, a parents' evening, children will talk to me in English, and then they'll speak to their parents in another language. And so this was really interesting because one of the things I did in this school was to send the children home with little microphones. So the children wore these microphones on when they left the classroom, and then when they got home, and their parents decided when they would switch them on and off, but they just had them on. They were on like a little sort of almost like a little necklace, and they were recording. And the moment the students were outside of the class, their language practices completely changed. They were speaking in English, they were speaking in Arabic, they were speaking in Romanian, they were moving between all of them. And when we listened to it with the teachers, they were like, this is where they sort of, I never heard that. I didn't know they did these things. And so it's interesting, again, and if I think about my own students at Essex, what languages are they using all the time, and should they be more present in the classroom? And what does that add if we're kind of, you know, if we're trying to support learning? So I think in that sense, one of the things for translanguaging is really this sort of trying to understand, it really puts at the center this idea of personhood. So in other words, kind of identity. So trying to make sure that we're thinking about how learners are, and in order to accommodate them more in the classroom. So here, this idea that sort of trying to separate out things from other, you know, from languages from the classroom is a really difficult thing to do, and almost impossible. And that there's no real value in doing that, because it's not how this system is working. So one of the things and what they promote is this idea that, you know, multilinguals, so either colleagues who are multilingual because of, you know, from birth, from living in multilingual societies, or who are multilingual as a result of study, don't experience the world monolingually. But if we accept that to be true, I don't know if your institution has any signs like this, but until recently, this was a sign that was near my office. It's not there anymore, we've taken it down. But this sort of sign where you see this type of thing happening a lot, like you're entering this particular zone. And of course, you know, on the one hand, I understand it's to promote the use of or learning of a particular language, but it also contradicts this idea of, you know, what's happening at the sense of the person, or the sense of kind of personhood. So for me, it becomes really problematic. Like, what are we asking people to do if we put signs like this in kind of learning spaces? I don't know that I think that's fair, if you like, to ask people to do that. And again, coming back to this idea of translanguaging, the ideas of there, it's sort of that, you know, there's a sort of a social justice issue or a moral issue that sort of says that, you know, if in classroom spaces people have to leave kind of other languages behind, then we're not treating people equally, because, you know, everyone's being tasked with being monolingual. That's okay to some extent, I guess, if all of the students are multilingual, and if you say to everyone, okay, we're all going to operate in this other language. But we know that we rarely are in classrooms where the language profile of all the students is the same, particularly in contexts like my own, where in classrooms at Essex, it's really likely that you would have perhaps students from 20 or 20, 30 different countries in a classroom. I think in the university in total, I think we have students from over 100 and I think it's over 200 different countries who attend a university. So with that come lots of other languages, but the space of the institution is all really English. And so that's a really curious one, I think, in a way. Like, why is that? Why does that have to be the case? And what do we gain, or what do we lose from such an approach? So what people like Othagi, who works a lot with colleagues like Ophelia Garcia, what he sort of suggests is that if we are asking students to work in these very monolingual spaces, that it's not fair. and it doesn't help anyone, because you're asking people to switch off a lot of what they know. So we're not using this full repertoire. We're not kind of allowing people to be themselves. And in this sense, it comes back to this idea of some of these older ideas about sort of being bilingual and what that means. So with a sense of balance. So I think before, in language learning, often one of the goals for people was this sense of being a balanced bilingual, that you could do the same things in each language, and that you could be sort of native, like whatever that means. And some of the work that colleagues like Garcia do, for example, says that this balanced bilingual idea is a real problem, and actually what we should be looking for is something that's a bit more. It's not about balance, but it's about being able to go to across different surfaces and do different things. So Garcia sort of suggests that perhaps this kind of more all-terrain vehicle, I think, potentially this is a car that could possibly fly as well. Do you know what I mean? All kinds of things you could do with this. So you can go anywhere, you can kind of be in these different situations, and that language and language learning should be more about helping students get to that point, rather than it be the sense where it's perfect in one and another language. And so some of the when we've asked people about this idea of linguistic repertoire, some of the things that people have talked about, so rather than sort of see it as being sort of separate, if we asked about kind of the how they use their language, and that language in this really broad sense, some people have referred to it as being a faulty radio, that depending on where they are, they can tune in. So this colleague, this was a colleague from the university, and they are speakers of Mandarin, they're speakers of English, and I think they're also speakers of French and German, maybe. But they said that they didn't feel that they could do exactly the same thing in each of these languages. And so what they felt was that they were a bit of a faulty radio. So at times, if you imagine a radio that's not working quite properly, is that kind of sort of static. And sometimes they could tune in really well to what people were saying, and they had this perfect radio, and other times they couldn't. So they sort of felt that that was a really useful metaphor for understanding their language. Others sort of said, well, I just don't see it. It's just my language. Someone else used this kind of idea of that they were, again, multilingual, and talking about it being a box of chocolates or a tray of paints, that they could just take what they needed when they needed in order to be able to kind of do their learning. And someone else, which is really great, sort of said it's my superpower. And I think this is a really nice metaphor for that, isn't it? So, these metaphors, or this metaphor, is really different to this kind of metaphor, I think, isn't it? Where, again, this was, I was recently doing some work in Nepal, looking at language policy there. And so we were looking at across the schools across the country to sort of see there's students coming into classrooms who are all very multilingual, but everything done in classes is really done monolingually. And this was one of the signs that was in the school. And I thought, this is really striking. Like, what does it tell people to do if we see signs like this? And how helpful is it? And also, what do you lose if you're only thinking and speaking in English? Because what we also know from lots of other research where things have used things like language portraits. So this is we've used this in work that we've been doing, but this isn't from my own work. This is from another place, but this was quite a nice example, I think, where asking students to kind of talk about their different languages and how they use them, and where and when and why. So if we're asking students in classes to only do this, we really risk them not being able to do all of these things. So here, this kind of, this person sort of talking about the ways in which they can, they feel as though if they're operating their phone or they're chatting on their phone, they're using kind of Portuguese, but there's something about their heart, there's something about their home where they think about that in terms of Cantonese. There's something about their legs somehow that kind of operates in a different language that's to do with money, or their feet. So again, if we're thinking about kind of language teaching and language learning, if we can adopt much more multilingual approaches, does that help capture this and kind of help us move away from some of this type of stuff? So just to sort of begin with kind of sort of some sort of conclusions then. So what could we do? Like, how do we work with some of this, and what would be the value of it? So I think, one of the things that colleagues like Suresh Kanagaraja, for example, have looked at is that if you're in a classroom situation where you're trying, if it's a language learning class or if it's a class in which you're there as a kind of multilingual learner, that there is a choice about how you can use those languages, and the choice is often restricted by the teacher, by the context, by the materials. And so what Kanagraj is sort of saying, you know, we can choose the extent to which we can help people use these different aspects of their repertoires, and that we have to let people feel that it's a safe space in order to do that. So this idea of favorable ecologies. So if we have classrooms where, you know, the messaging is very clearly, you're not allowed to do this type of stuff, then that's not particularly inclusive, or they're not sort of setting these kind of favorable conditions for people to be able to use their range of language. And so what Kanagaraja, also in a kind of university context, has been doing is sort of, he has some really interesting work on writing and writing development. And so what he did with his students was to say, rather than encourage them only to write in and through English, his institution is an English medium institution as well, and the final assessment is to produce a 3,000 word essay, for example. And he said his students were really struggling with that, like how do you do the writing? And so what he said was that he allowed his students, or promoted and actively encouraged his students, to write the text multilingually. So to write in whatever languages they felt comfortable, to come to tutorials, to come and see him and have, you know, to talk through it, and to either leave the text as a multilingual text or to use the multilingual draft as a form to kind of then help to do translations, and then build upon that in order to kind of make these kind of repertoires and make these multilingual moments much more transparent and much more obvious. And so what he found was that this really improved students' writing ability, it really improved their confidence, and it improved their enjoyment of the writing. And ultimately, I think people sort of, from the research that he was doing, felt that it was their own text rather than this sort of weird thing that they had to do through English or another language that they didn't feel connected to. So this is really interesting kind of research, I think, that is certainly something I've tried a bit in my own practice. One of the students who we were working with a couple of years ago in one of my classes said, you know, she's an English speaker and she didn't like having to write formal, or she didn't feel comfortable writing formal literature reviews. So she's a master's degree student. She had to write a kind of a fairly long essay, and she felt that the tone or the style was really difficult and she didn't really enjoy it. And it was a real struggle for her. So what she wanted to do was to write in her own language, which was sort of, you know, still English, but perhaps a variety of English, vernacular forms, so perhaps some more informal uses, and to try and bring the two things together. So what we decided in the end was that she would do the sort of literature review, so this more formal essay, and on the side, she would use track change comments to talk about these things how she wanted to talk about them. And so she ended up with a really, really interesting assignment where she had lots of writing that sounded like this, kind of, you know, quoting from Kanagaraja and, you know, very formal English. And down the side of the text, she had text box that said, well, you know, I'm not sure about this. I found it really hard. I wasn't really sure. She used non-standard spelling. She used kind of, you know, language that she would use with her friends. And she found that to be a really interesting way of bringing together these two parts of her identity in a way that allowed her to be included in the text. And so this is sort of, again, interesting ways, I think, in which we can try and help support learners, you know, moving between these kind of separations of practice, maybe. So in terms of what we might be able to do and things that we're trying, and certainly in kind of some of the work that we're doing, is this idea of understanding student language and ensuring that there's things to support it, increasing teachers, you know, recognition of teachers' language as well. So we often work with teachers who say, oh, I can't use that language in class, I'm not really supposed to. So, well, actually, this might be really helpful to do that. Increasing recognition of different kind of community languages and things, like all of these things can be ways of shaping practice or shifting it towards these things that perhaps enable identities to come together a bit more. And this idea, for me anyway, certainly this idea of moving towards more multilingual texts and multilingual assessment. So what does that help us to do in terms of supporting learners in their in this sort of journey? So again, just to go back to some of these images, I think if we can kind of use these principles for some of the ways in which we design materials, some of the ways in which we design our classroom spaces, my assumption, my goal, I think my hypothesis, and I think this is being shown in lots of other people's work anyway, so I think these are actually happening, is that what you get then are more effective language learners. You get people who are much more engaged in classroom processes, and you get language use that's much more comfortable for people. I think we'll still see these sorts of tensions maybe, but they're much more fluid, or there's space for us to talk through these. Because I think if we understand that, you know, students have sometimes these really competing or conflicting senses of self, this is a much more, this is a much healthier, I think, place to start than just sort of pretending it's not happening. So that was sort of some of the ideas I wanted to share, really. I'm happy to, if anyone has any questions, or if you'd like to discuss any of this a bit more, I'm very happy to kind of go back over anything, or yeah, give you a moment to have a think about any questions. But thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Cosley. It's very interesting. I think the first questions that you pop up about how do we feel in learning foreign language really, they really do apply to us here. Like I myself consider that when I speak in English, I tend to be very strict and not funny at all. And yeah, and so many students think that they are more confident in speaking English, but still the issue of, you know, writing with I is also highly concerned here. Like many students are very discouraged to write their essay in I. They prefer to write the author or the, you know, other than I. And
Yeah.
so that is very applied here as well. I mean,
Yeah.
our students experience the same things here.
Yeah.
So yeah, if I may summarize a little bit from what you say, correct me if I'm wrong. The most important thing is actually not to create monolingualisms in a classroom practice, rather than it should be better if we acknowledge multilingualisms. We have multilingual tags, we have multilingual assessment, so that students can experience what translanguaging is as a pedagogical tools, and also as the state of personhood. This is very interesting when you say that translanguaging can be state of personhood, because I think not many of us understand this clearly in practice. Like many teachers might feel like, how would we consider it okay to consider they are successful in learning when they are using many multiple languages? And so this is kind of interesting, but I do understand that when we are acknowledging their languages, and then they're going to be more engaged in classroom, and then they're going to learn better. I experienced that as well with my students. All right. So we have 30 minutes for question and sessions. If you do have questions, please raise your hands. Anyone? You can also write on the chat box if you want to ask questions. We do have some people asking these questions. While waiting for the other questions, if I may to say, so like I said earlier, how to detect the students' progress in learning English when we acknowledge multilingual tasks, multilingual assessment. Because I believe that most teachers, especially, they will consider that if they are not using complete English, they will consider that these students are not using English because they are not capable in using English, rather than thinking that the student might say that because they feel like this, like it's more like me to say in this kind of language. So that's one.
Yeah. I think that is a great question, and that is a question that that teachers ask a lot, and I think that's a very valid question. So I think some possible answers might be that. So one of the things that we're trying to look at, I think, is if the end point is still, if the end goal is still sort of English, like fine, and it's a particular type of English. So say, for example, we all, quite a lot of my students are having to deal with things like IELTS exams, and that's a sort of an exam, like examination, things that are really terrifying for students and hard, and they require a particular kind of language, don't they? They're often kind of, again, there, like the end point has to be a certain thing, but the journey to it, I think, can be really different. So in terms of kind of where previously, I think over the last sort of 30 years, I mean, certainly when I was training as a teacher, we were not allowed to, or not encouraged to, in those classes even, use other languages or use multilingual approaches to teaching that type of exam English. Whereas now, if I were teaching those classes, I would do those very differently. I would do those multilingually. I would kind of use those other languages as a resource for checking and for checking understanding, and then moving towards this sort of final version that would be all in English. And I think that's the same for essays as well, to some extent. That there's that journey or that process that can be much more dynamic and much more fluid, and that's a building block for these kind of perhaps more monolingual texts, if we need a monolingual text at the end. I think also as well, there's that sort of sense of, what is the context for the language that's being used? So I think in most interactions where people might be using English, there is likely now, even our globalized world and the number of people sort of speaking other languages, that most of those interactions are possibly done in and through various languages as well, or there's the opportunity for that. And so I think that this idea that actually where language is used, looking at it more that the actual default now is that perhaps these things are much more translanguaged than not, and that's also okay. So that if there is a movement between, it doesn't mean that there's a lack of knowledge of a particular language, but perhaps there's just an understanding of the situation that says it's okay for me to translanguage here because I know that these other users can understand that. I guess a possible thing for classrooms is to make sure that people are aware of when those changes can happen, isn't it? And we know with really young multilinguals that they really are sensitive to that. So the students in the classrooms that I was working in Essex, for example, they knew the moment they entered that classroom, even though the colleagues were nice and there's things written, and they knew that had to be a very monolingual space. And I don't know that anyone actively told them, or they weren't shouted at, no one was angry with them, but they were just adjusting really quickly to what they could use. So I think for other, is as a kind of a sort of teacher training, maybe something that we can also do is like, when is it okay to do this movement, and how do we tune into that? And if we need to recast things for people, like how, again, being able to be really flexible with what we're using. Is not a perfect answer by any means, but I think it's sort of, yeah.
Yeah, well, that is pretty much, because we do have an international programs class here as well, and that is a required class that it should be in English all the times. The instructions should be in English. The student must respond in English, and compared to the other classes, which is not required, not the international programs, I also sense that students engage better in the non-IUP, in the non-international program, because whenever they've got block on something, they can just say something different from what they have to, and the class is more alive, and I think in that way students are braver to ask, and that is better, I think. So yeah, I think it's really important to know when and how we should be able to, to, like what you said earlier, to move forward, when we can, when it is okay to use the student's language and not. All right. We do have a question here on the chat box. Yes. So Dr. Cosley, as I'm feeling under the weather. Okay, my name is Laras. I had an experience with language learning, particularly in self-studying Spanish and Italian. And I had the same issue where I felt like it was difficult to balance between the two in addition to my Indonesian and English. In that sense, what would you suggest to self-studying students who would like to try and apply multilingualism? Yeah, so it's on the case of self-study.
Yeah. Sorry, just making it. And I think, thank you, and I hope. Sorry to hear you're not feeling very well. But thank you for the question. And I think there's one question maybe. So, and apologies, I answer your question with a question. But one thing might be to think about, what are the contexts for using those languages? So in sort of self-study, which is really important, isn't it? And we know that lots of students, that is a method that people are using, particularly with things like Duolingo and where those things are much accessible now, aren't they? And that's a really good thing. But I guess sort of what other opportunities are there where you can sort of practice this? So one of the key things, and I think this comes back to your point as well, is that there's a reason for using language, isn't there? And there's a reason for using kind of a particular type of language at a particular time. So if there's a context for using it, then perhaps this is where this more multilingual practice happens. So with self-study, often what might be difficult or perhaps a constraint is where if you don't have someone to use that language
Practice
with,
yes.
To practice with and whatever, or to find situations where that might be possible to kind of extend the range of practice that you're using. So if you're self-studying, like what's the method for that? Are you watching film? Are you kind of engaging? Is there music? So we're working across those different genres as well might be helpful in terms of just exposure to different things. But trying, I think, to have people to engage with, I think is always key there, isn't it? Because then that's where you can perhaps, again, if you can find someone with a similar profile to yourself, where you've got sort of Indonesian, English and Spanish there, you would then be able to perhaps sort of share those sort of practices of moving about and kind of, or having conversations that allow you to make use of that, I guess. But that is a challenge, I think, with self-study, or any kind of study in a way, isn't it? It's making sure that you've got opportunities to practice it, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, especially self-study means, like you set your own goals, you set your own standard, and nobody's really correct if you are making mistakes. And so it's going to be more challenging. Yeah. Well, nowadays, I think our students learns a lot of languages due to the influence of technologies and mass media. And so I was kind of surprised also that they are learning Spanish and Italian here, which is, I mean, we don't really hear that. Our students do study Korean and Japanese, the local Asian language, but not this too. And so, Laras, this is going to be very interesting actually to know why you prefer to have self-study on these two languages. Okay. Do we have other questions? You can raise your hands. While waiting again. Oh, Bugirindra has your hand. Oh, hi, good morning, Bugirindra. I believe Bugirindra is your students.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm currently working with Bugirindra. Yeah.
All right, go on, ask your questions, Bugirindra.
Hello, Tracy. Well, I know it's so funny because I can ask Tracy directly after this. But anyway, I just also want to use the opportunity to say thank you for Budui, Pak Harry, and everyone here. And oh my God, I miss you so much. Tracy, I have a question because I tried to doing the self-reflection for my teaching practices as well. Well, at the time when the students ask questions, for example, if they forget about a vocabulary during our discussion, they'll be like, what to call, and then they mention the Indonesian name in English. And I did something like, just try to remember it and like give her time to think about it, because I thought that it will help her memorizing things and learn better in English. But now after discussing this in this today's session, I feel like, did I do something wrong? Maybe because maybe that's how students learn, when they can construct sentences and then they forget about something, so they can directly ask me what's to call something in English, and then I can just say it directly, and then they can continue the sentences. You know what I mean? So I think that now reflected back on it, I feel like maybe I distract their thinking because they have to think fast. They forget about one word, and then I stop them to make them thinking longer to just find a word. So which one do you think is better? Do you think it's for me just to help her, for example, if that happened again, because that happened a lot, and then to make them directly think about the continuity of the sentences? Or do you think I can still do that, like, just try to
yeah. That's a good, that's a good question. And I mean, the last thing I would want to do is to make you feel bad about doing things, or that it's right or wrong. That that's not the message. But I think what's interesting is that obviously those students feel comfortable to ask that question and use the Indonesian. So that's already doing that sort of work of translanguaging, I think, anyway. So that's also, that's just a good thing. So being able to, how you respond to that is also going to be informed by all kinds of things, isn't it? So I think your response of saying, or giving a bit of time to think about it is absolutely why is that's appropriate. I think that's absolutely fine. And that's one choice you make, isn't it? There's other ways that you can do that. And I think providing those opportunities is really important, isn't it? And I think classrooms are getting better at that in terms of understanding the opportunity that different languages in classrooms kind of give us as teachers and students, but also that it's okay to take a moment and ask a question, or it's okay to not give the answer immediately to students, or it's okay to use that. I think that as long as students get that message, I think that's, in terms of supportive teaching and kind of what we might sort of call like language supportive pedagogies as well, I think that space has to be there. So I think that is right. And then there's other things you can do around asking other students to sort of fill in the gaps, or providing that. So I think and I think I don't know, I think you know me quite well anyway, but I think we can all imagine situations as well when we find ourselves in everyday conversation where we're like, what's that word? So I think it's normal that we don't know things, or it's normal that we forget things. I think sometimes there's a pressure when we're learning foreign languages or other languages to think we have to know everything all the time, because somehow, if not, it's a reflection of our lack of ability, rather than it being, actually, this is just how communication works. Like, our brains are brilliant, wonderful things, but they can't do everything all the time in always in those ways. So I think that actually, reflecting sort of natural, normal communication is also really helpful in classrooms as well, because I think often one of the things that students do mention, I think, isn't it, or we may have experiences of as well, as we're in a language classroom, language is told us in certain ways, we hear it in certain ways, we practice it in certain ways, and we go out into the place where we think this language should be happening, and it doesn't sound anything like what we learn in the classroom, and we don't understand anything, and then people begin to question what that is, because again, I think classrooms can be potentially more artificial than they need to be. So I think that type of those types of interactions where they are more sort of normalized is not a bad thing, I think.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Bu Gerindra. Yeah, well, we had done that previously, right, Bu Gerindra? Like many times in my classroom, I also ask students to keep on using English, because I thought that must be the one that we idealized for. All right. We do have a questions here. I'm reading it for you. So students today are very tuned up more on informal types of learnings, like they are preferring to use music, utterances on social media as sources of their language learnings, like they are reading many news from many different worlds, and so they've got many different kinds of English. So is it considered as the preferable ecology for translanguaging, or is it the other way? What do you think?
Yeah, that's great, I think, in a way, isn't it? Like that sort of, and I think that sort of fits also. So I think alongside these ideas of translanguaging, I think that there has been a really important move, hasn't there, within English language teaching or how we understand English more generally, to that view of kind of Englishes in the plural. And it has to be that there's more work on kind of world Englishes, how English is, in motion, that it's, that it's not linked to particular places or particular people, that it's, that it is a kind of a language of everyone to some extent. So I think, the more sources students or people have access to, again, I think that sort of image from Garcia of that kind of all-terrain vehicle, just the more options you have for what you can do with it, I think. So listening to music, there's sort of some, I mean, it's not quite, it's slightly, well, it is linked to this, I think, but one of the people whose work I think most has informed quite a lot of my thinking over the years has been Pierre Bourdieu. So talks, sort of a French sociologist who looks at ideas of how people, particularly working in schools, around sort of language and language uses and how people learn and classroom practices, really. So one of the things that he sort of looks at is this idea of capital. And he sort of said, that often in schooling systems, particularly in France at the time, but certainly this is true for the UK context, I think, as well, that students come into classes not having the same backgrounds and not having the same kind of what he calls kind of social capital. So in contexts like the UK, where we have quite a class system where, if you have gone to a particular type of school, you might be exposed to particular ideas, or things like going to the opera is something that we often associate with really this kind of high class, kind of high social class. And what Bourdieu's work looks at is this idea of, what capital do people have and what's its value? So he sort of often in schooling context, the capital is this really sort of formal capital. It's kind of high prestige. It's attached to sort of higher social classes. And there's a mismatch then between the capital that people coming in from lower socioeconomic backgrounds have, or this kind of everyday stuff. And so he's been really advocating for, changing that. One of the things he also looks at is this idea of linguistic capital. So some people's languages are worth more than others, or some varieties of English, for example, are worth more than others. He doesn't necessarily apply it to English, but it has been applied to English in that sense then. And we see that a lot in classrooms, particularly around accent and accent bias and accentism, where students in classrooms in England will be told that their language isn't very good because it's not standard English. And again, I think there's all kinds of problems with that, and there's all kinds of movements to sort of try and stop that kind of thinking. But I think for kind of language learning, it's also really interesting because this sense of capital, which we know is out there, we know that, you've got certain resources that we can use, and certain capital will allow us to have conversations with certain people or will allow us to do certain things. So if we think of kind of capital as resources, I think if students are listening to kind of different materials, so social media, whether that's news channels, whether that's film, sort of Netflix, all of those things, what that does, I think, is immediately, potentially in these kind of very globalized worlds, is to give people an opportunity to have conversations. Be like, oh, do you know this? Or, oh, I've heard that. Or there's a purchase, or you've got an entrance into things. And again, I think that's to do with then this type of identity work that you can do, because you're someone that knows something about that thing, or you've heard that before, so it gives you an opportunity. Whereas if we stick with really sort of very traditional, and traditional, I mean sort of things around kind of, kind of the types of language that we often see in kind of English language textbooks or French language teaching textbooks that have these often quite sort of stereotyped, quite sort of sanitized language, that you're just in that lane if that's all we've got. But if we have this option of kind of, our classrooms, our learning being informed by lots of other things, then I think your opportunities for usage is increased exponentially. So I think that's really interesting how it ties to that sort of sense of kind of capital, or sense of kind of ability to do things, and go into different situations.
Yeah, that's really true, because we also experience that the lack of diverse course books, that will allow students to have different types of learnings, and so that is also creating a problem. So that's why sometimes compared to what they've learned through textbook and compared to how the students actually learns, I will sometimes, there is a gap because students are learning using all of the stuffs that are not even mentioned in the books, and that was something actually.
Yeah, no,
Right.
absolutely. That's really interesting.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Kosley.
Okay.
Yeah, there is another question here is on the chat box from Adam. So Adam asked that, I'll read it for you. So I often feel like there is this unstated implicit agreement between my classmate to be monolingual in Indonesian, especially because when I start to speak in English, they would start to tease me with the unorthodox phrases I would use to respond to me with deliberately broken English. It made me avoid speaking in English altogether, even though, as I have previously said, I feel more like myself when I listen English. What do you think of this?
I think, classrooms are wonderful spaces, aren't they? But at the same time, classrooms can be really difficult, and they can be spaces where things happen that we don't always, want. So, one thing in here that, Adam, I would say is that this idea of broken English, like I think it's a really interesting concept, isn't it? Because the opposite to that would be fixed English.
Yes.
So, but what does that look like? Is there even such a thing? So I don't know how, and again, I think it's part of this idea that, that things have to be perfect and things have to be, we've got this kind of goal, or we're told that it should be a certain way. And I don't know that that's true. I don't know that my English is fixed. I don't know what that means. I don't think it's broken, and I don't think yours is either. So I think in that sense, I would move away from some of those ideas, and then sort of think, okay, well, what else is going on there in those sort of situations where English might be sort of, just difficult in that situation. And if that classroom isn't the space for you to use English, then there are other spaces for you to do that, where you might then get slightly different response, or different sort of set of practices, or to sort of carry on, and that's what you do. And so I think in a way that confidence of, your own kind of practice is also okay. But I do think those ideas of broken, because we do hear that a lot as well, like the broken English, and I think again if we think that language is always in development, that we don't necessarily need to frame our own practices in those ways. I don't know that that's a positive position to put yourself in, really. So perhaps sort of, think about it as that's your language on that day, and next week it might be different. In 3 years' time, it's going to be different, and that's part of the joy, in a way, of whatever language we're thinking of, that it's constantly changing. But those binaries, I think those binaries come in all the time, don't they? This sort of idea that it's standard, it's non-standard, it's good, it's bad, it's orthodox, unorthodox, it's broken, fixed. And again, I think they are kind of, they're tropes that are there, but I don't. We know sort of that they come from, I think they do come from this kind of push towards standardization, a push towards a sort of a monolingualizing. And again, I don't think people are bad. I don't think people are awful, and they've done this thing because they're sort of terrible monsters. But I think there's just sort of this idea that you can measure a standard, can't you? Potentially it's easier for us as teachers to perhaps say, oh, that's right or wrong, because you don't have the third person S, so therefore it's wrong. You think, in most cases, things like that are, they're grey areas, aren't they? Like my parents, for example, the English they never use the third person S on things. Like my mum will regularly say, oh, he didn't do that. Like, and I think when I was younger, in my younger days of teaching, I would try and correct her. And of course, she's my mum, and it's terribly disrespectful of me to do that. And she would shout at me and say, I'm not in your class, stop it. And now I'm just like, actually, yeah, that was really wrong. I should never have pointed out your English. And it's just, she has a variety of English that doesn't use that. So again, like that's the way that she speaks. It's not right, it's not wrong. So that's just what she does. So again, I think part of what is really exciting about language is that, and this comes back to those earlier points, I think, the positive comments from people, where you can be whatever you want to be in and through language, that it does give us this opportunity to try on different identities and to kind of play those out and to kind of adopt them into what we do. And that there is space for us to say it. Like, it's okay for me to, when I speak to my parents, to use that same language, but then it's also okay for me in a kind of a more formal situation to not do that. Or it's okay for me in my teaching to have those discussions with students to say, well, if you're chatting to someone, who you know well, and it's fine to do that. If you're trying to pass the TOEFL or IELTS exam, it's probably less fine. You're probably not going to get the full mark for that. So giving people power, or kind of that sense of agency to make those decisions, I think is a really nice thing we could do as teachers as well. That sort of empowering learners to make informed choices rather than feel always that they're kind of that here's this standard and that they can never get there. I think that's an idealized spot for us to try and aim towards anyway.
Yeah, well, Adam is one of my students and he loves to speak English most of the time in the class, and I appreciate that actually. But yeah, just like what you've mentioned, the classmate can be very cruel. They can be teased and say things. Like students, like the one phrase that you were talking about earlier, one of the myths that what do you call it? The English doesn't have any accent. Right, right. So here in Indonesia and the Japanese people here, they tend to have the English madok, they call it, because it sounds like it is English, but it's said in more in a tone of a Japanese language. And people make fun of it many times, which I don't see why it's correct actually, but sometimes I enjoy listening to it too.
Yeah. No, definitely. And I think again, it's sort of a way of trying to sort of celebrate differences in a way, isn't it? Like that again, that there is, I mean, the beauty of language, I think, in all kinds of ways, isn't it? And whatever language we're thinking of, is that it has scope to incorporate all of these things. And so we can sound and do things and be understood by one another. We can understand that, there's a group of people over here that sound in a particular way for all kinds of reasons. And then there's another group of people and they sound like this for all kinds of reasons. And that's fine. And we're in our own group and we sound and do and do different things as well. But we're all mutually intelligible to one another, or we can we can seek clarification, and it doesn't have to be a problem in that sense, or it's not a deficit. And it's okay to recognize those differences, and it's okay to find them charming, interesting, funny, and all of those sorts of things. But it is also, that again, if we're exposing kind of learners to those varieties more and more in classes, it makes us, I think, better listeners anyway. So our ears are attuned to kind of hear more varieties of English or whatever language it is. It also makes us more responsive to that too, and receptive of it ourselves. But also it gives us choices as well. I mean, I distinctly remember sort of some students who I taught in Hong Kong who both, there were two students in particular who had, I don't know if this is meaningful to people, but we have a radio program. So the BBC in Britain, historically has always been quite posh. That's a very formal English, isn't it? And there's been a particular type of training that I don't have that type of accent, and I don't want that type of accent. But the people were trained to kind of speak in a particular way. And one of my students who I worked with in Hong Kong, there's a particular radio program called, it was on Radio 4. And, when I was younger, I would never listen to Radio 4, but now I'm sort of an older lady. I can listen to Radio 4 and it's sort of news and serious programs or whatever. And most of the presenters on there have a very particular, very standard British accent that's close to received pronunciation, and it's very anyway. So this student of mine in Hong Kong, who was I think like 18 at the time, maybe 19, had this accent, and I thought, crikey, like how did you get that? Like, what did you do? And he said I listened to Radio 4. He was just like, I listened to different radio programs in the UK and in the US, and I decided I wanted to sound like the man I listened to on the radio. And he was like, so I just listened to it every day. and I copied and I practiced, and he was just like, and I'm confident that I sound like someone from Radio 4. And I said, you really do. That's really incredible. Like yeah. And then another student, a different student said she had a very different same class, very different accent. And I thought, she sounded as though, so colleagues from the north of, or, in the north of England, I mean, there's all kinds of accents all over England. And in the north of England, in particular, this part of Yorkshire, there's a Sheffield accent. So it's a particular type of sound. And this student sounded like she was from Sheffield. And I said, oh, do you have is your mum or dad or family? Do you have family from Yorkshire? Sure. And she really looked shocked and then really looked happy. And I said, oh, sorry. She was just like, no. She was like, I have a favorite band, and my favorite band are, I can't remember who she said now, but they were from Sheffield. She said, and I listened to their lyrics in their singing. She was just like, she was like, I thought it sounded really lovely and I wanted to sound like them. She was just like, so the same thing. She said, I just copied, I listened to it all the time. And she was just like, so I'm really glad you hear that. She was like, I've never been there. I've never been to Sheffield. I don't know anyone from Sheffield, but that's just the sound I wanted to have for myself. And so again, these sort of, that's what they decided they wanted to sound like. And again, I think that's also okay for learners. And I think it comes back to that idea of kind of things like language portraits. We can ask learners what they want to sound like, and then perhaps try and help them if they want to sound a particular way. Like, it doesn't have to be, there isn't a particular way of speaking English. They have to know what they want, I think. So and then kind of own it. So these students, they were just really happy with how they sounded and were willing to talk about it as well. And I think that's quite important too, isn't it? That there are choices and you can sound particular ways, and you can, again, sort of other students wanted to sound really from Hong Kong. So they we've never tried to get rid of a Hong Kong accent because I am from Hong Kong and I love it and this is who I am. So again, that was also really nice because students, again, in the same group could all be their own people in this, this was just adding to their sense of self rather than taking away, thinking like they couldn't do it or something. But it was really interesting.
Yeah, even if they don't want to have particular accent and they end up sounds like their native language, that is also still great.
Perfect. Right? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And that's what makes it really interesting, doesn't it? Gosh, if we all sounded the same, it would be really miserable. Like I think it's sort of, that wouldn't, I think that would
right.
Really,
yeah, like when when you go to India and then people are having that kind of English India, and we go to Singapore, they're speaking different, right? And so maybe one day when English become more, like if more people in Indonesia speak English, they might have different types of accent in saying
absolutely.
English.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm sure there must already be sort of Indonesian English is kind of there, it's probably, some of your students and some of your colleagues might well start to chart those, and that can be, that's an area of area of really exciting work, I think. Because it will be there, won't it? And it is, yeah. But sorry, just one other thought I just had was something else that I was sort of interested in as well as it's linked to accent, I think, a little bit, but one thing where, again, kind of accent becomes more than just it being, I want to sound a particular way. We had a PhD student in Essex a few years ago who was doing his PhD at an institution in Spain, but was spending some time in the UK as well. And he had a stammer. So, that sort of it's a speech impediment that sort of means they can't, there was a certain words or certain sounds that became really difficult for him to pronounce. And so there's a delay, there's kind of it's a cognitive impairment. So there is actually, in terms of studies, there's something with the brain that's preventing this apparently. So what he said was that, so he was English, he's English by birth, but he has spent a lot of time in Spain, and so was really interested in his Spanish and how he uses Spanish. So when you spoke to him in English, would have his stammer is there, and he would do that. But in Spanish, he said he stammers in a different way. And so this was really interesting. So he said in learning Spanish, that we stammered less and stammered in and could hide it because he wasn't particularly embarrassed about it. But he said it was hidden because in Spanish he said he had this kind of style where he'd be like "sí me," and the stammer would kind of get absorbed into this use of Spanish. And so his PhD was looking at stammering and other sort of foreign language learning. And so what he found that was for most people who had stammers, that the learning of the foreign language helped them or changed the way they stammered in their L1 languages as well, but provided them a space to be very different. So particularly with colleagues where they sort of said, they would not speak out loud in a kind of an English class because they were concerned sort of stammering, but in French, where they just didn't care so much, and the way that French worked in their mouth allowed or meant that the stammer wasn't as pronounced, meant that they could just sort of carry on. So again, it's sort of, it's not just a sort of an aesthetic thing and kind of I want to sound a particular way, but for all of this group, there's some really interesting research done there. So again, in terms of actually sort of it being perhaps a space where they can really open up for people as well, like this idea of sound, this idea of kind of what we do with our voice and how it sounds to other people is also really interesting. But that was another area again that sort of saying that gives people an option to potentially kind of join up pieces of their identity that might otherwise feel fractured, I think.
Yeah, even with the cognitive impairment, people may have different sounds in a different language.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. I think, Bhumita, do you want to ask questions?
Right, thank you so much, Rudy. And Dr. Kosli, thank you so much for your
mind-blowing discussion or explanation. It really opens my mind how language and foreign language learner's identity can be very fluid. It's really opened my eyes. But then I want to ask from the other way around, would it be counterproductive if we ask our students to, have a particular standard? Because I overheard one day my colleague of mine complain about the new management policy that complain about the standard of our language, especially in terms of English competency or English competency. So she said that the management complained that our students, our graduates, cannot speak English or they are not competent in English. In this way, our students or our graduates are unable to compete with graduates from other universities in Indonesia. So my question, do you think it will be counterproductive if we, to some extent, impose on our students that you need to have to meet this particular standard in terms of English, both spoken and written English? Thank you, Dr. Kosli.
Thank you. Thank you. And I think I don't know if this is going to make you feel better or worse. So I apologize, but I think the management or my own university says the same things about our own students, that their standards of English aren't good enough, and that our students go out into the workplace with poor standards of English. And I think sometimes that's and I think quite a lot of the stuff that I've done in terms of looking at language policy is that argument is often said, and I say this as respectfully as I can. I think that's often said by people that don't know about the standard of people's languages. So I think there's that stuff possibly is difficult. But I also think that I think you're right, that if we insist on particular standards and that's the only thing that we provide the students with, whether or not they find that in the actual workplace is a really interesting one, because again, we know that workplaces require certain things or ask for certain things, but we also know that workplaces don't always know what they want of students, and they don't know what kind of language practices they're looking for. So lots of kind of work that we did in Hong Kong was asking workplaces, like, what sort of things do you need? Oh, well, they just need to be good at communicating. Like, that's really broad, isn't it? And so providing students, I think, with that structure to be able to demonstrate a confidence in language and competencies in language. So if we've got graduates that can say, actually, I can do all of these things, I can send sort of different types of emails, or I can write business reports, or I can give an oral presentation. And if they can give a good account of themselves, I think that's really, a really positive thing that graduates can leave universities with. But I also think that, they can be a sort of, they can have that standard as an option, but we should also be providing them with these other resources as well, because they're not going to be talking to everybody all the time in that kind of standard way. So knowing when to sort of make that switch, or knowing how to kind of manage those changes, I think are really interesting, rather than it just being like, you have to have this one thing. Because I would also sort of be, we're not concerned, but I would be interested to know, like, how, if they were leaving with what we thought was a standard form of English and a standard form of communication, whether that actually got them better jobs more quickly or not, I wonder whether there's other things going on there. It's not necessarily how they, it's not necessarily how they said something in a response, perhaps in an interview, but it's probably what they said, or how they may have positioned themselves, or something else. But often it gets reduced down to, oh, the language isn't very good, because it's an easier thing to comment on, rather than actually, they just didn't work well in the interview, or the personalities didn't kind of, or we preferred this other person. It's often easier to say it's the language. And so I think trying to provide students with that confidence to compete against. So again, I don't know, for our own university, for example, where we are much like yourselves, we're a great institution. We have, really high quality lecturers. We do really great stuff. We've got really great students. But for us, we're not Oxford, and we're not Cambridge, and we're not kind of this sort of Russell Group university. So we're always judged as being this sort of thing. So our graduates have to work a bit harder, I think, sometimes at sort of undergraduate level, less so at kind of, postgraduate level, because, people are just a bit more aware of where, what research is happening and where. But for undergraduate students, I think often they have to kind of do a bit of extra work if they're not from these really, really, really prestigious universities, where I imagine that those language practices of the students there are probably no different to the students coming from our own institutions as well. It's just the expectation. They say, oh, you're from here, the expectation is X. And so I think if we can do something that disrupts those expectations, then I think that's really interesting and exciting for people, because then we've got graduates you can choose, actually, I can perform in a way that I'm supposed to, and I can compete with these other graduates who may or may not be viewed as being better than me, but I also have a choice to do that in a way that's comfortable and true to myself as well. And I think if we've got graduates like that coming through the system, then I think it's not long before that system changes and the voices of management then change, because they're also, they're also kind of, moments in time as well. So I think, again, sort of things like, and it's not the same example, but things like the BBC, which are often, held up as being this particular kind of thing. We've seen changes there, really publicly, changes around how language is used, and there's more accent, there's more variation. And I think Britain is becoming somewhere where it's easier perhaps to sound different and get high paying, high qualified jobs. It's changing. I mean, it's a slow change, but it is changing. And I think that's the same, the more we advocate for these different voices, I think the more difficult those positions become for people to tell us, oh, you have to be this or that, because the overwhelming evidence is that people don't. So I think it's a difficult one, isn't it? And the job of teaching and teachers is really gets bigger and bigger in a way, doesn't it? But I think that sense of actually knowing when and how, if we can, and I think it comes back to that sense of empowerment. If we can empower students to kind of make those choices and understand the game a bit more, and I think this comes back to some of Bourdieu's stuff as well, that you're kind of, when you use your I don't know if people play cards, but when you play your cards, I think it's sort of that there's that sort of metaphor as well. I think, like particularly with language, like how you perform that. So it's interesting. Sorry, I'm not sure that was a very long kind of possibly not answer to your question, but I think it's a really interesting one. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Kosli. That's very true.
Yeah. Yeah, like teaching, management, the target markets, they are intertwined in a different way.
Yeah.
And it's just teachers actually should know better because they deal with the students. They are facing the students every day. They know what they are doing, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Dr. Cosley. I think that is, we are come close to the end of our sessions. I don't think I need to summarize it again because we have talked very clear on how is it important for teachers to acknowledge students' multilingual ability and that to be able to open space for students so that they can be more included in the learning sessions and that so that they can be more engaged, and in that way it will open chances for them to keep on learning even if they graduate. Even after they graduate, I believe as long as they have this sense of learning, they will keep on learning.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, well, once again, thank you very much. This is really a lot of stuff that we've learned from you today. Thank you very much, Dr. Cosley. Thank you for your willingness to share all of these ideas with us. And so, yeah, it has been a great webinar. It has been a great lectures. Thank you once again.
Thank you so much. Thank you again for the invite. It's been great to meet you all and to talk these things through with you. And I look forward to, we can remain in contact and kind of have more discussions like this. It's great. So thank you so much.
Yeah. I would love that. Okay.
Brilliant.
Yeah. Well, thank you once again. And so I return it to the Master of Ceremony, Houdini. So for you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Tracy Cosley, for the insightful session. And thank you to Dwi Wulandari SFMA as the moderator who hosted the engaging discussion today. Thank you. Before we close this event, maybe for Dr. Oktisa Herisanda will give the closing statement, then give the certificate to Dr. Tracy Cosley as a speaker for today.
Close to. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, and dear students, I would like to take this opportunity to extend my heartfelt gratitude to our speaker, Dr. Tracy Cosley, for very, very inspiring lecture this afternoon. And then this thanks also goes to every participant who has dedicated this evening to join us in this enlightening experience. Your involvement has been invaluable. Today we explore how learners navigate their identities within the context of foreign language learning. We examine the unique challenges they face, from cultural differences to the impact of social dynamics. The story shared today highlights the resilience and adaptability that define the learner's journey, reminding us that language is not just a tool for communication, but also a bridge to understanding and bridging diverse identities. We have learned that negotiating identity in foreign learning is a dynamic process. It involves not only the acquisition of language skills, but also the development of confidence and self-awareness. As educators, it is our responsibility to foster an inclusive environment where students feel empowered to express their multifaceted identities. By doing so, we enrich the learning experience for everyone. Thank you for your active participation and thoughtful contribution. I look forward to seeing how this discussion will be inspire your future in foreign language learning. Finally, let's not forget to express our sincere appreciation to the organizing committee, Ibu Dwi Wulandari, and the Faculty of Humanities at University Diponegoro. Your hard work and dedication have been instrumental in making this visiting lecture a success. Once again, thank you all for your participation, and we look forward to seeing you next lecture. And then Dr. Desi Kosley, as the representative of English Literature Department, I would like to give this certificate to you. Please.
Oh, thank you so much. That's great.
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Tracy Kosley, for very, very interesting, inspiring lecture this afternoon. Thank you very much once again.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for Dr. Oktiva Heri Chandra and Hum. And then the last statement, hopefully what we learned today will be useful for all of us today. Thank you, everyone. See you again in our future event.
Brilliant.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you very much
Thank you
again,
very
Dr.
much,
Kosley.
Thank you so much. Have a great rest of the day. Thanks again.
Okay. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.